Hello, I'm Natalie Zett, and welcome to Flower in the River. This podcast, inspired by my book of the same name, explores the 1915 Eastland disaster in Chicago and its enduring impact, particularly on my family's history. We'll explore the intertwining narratives of others impacted by this tragedy as well, and we'll dive into writing and genealogy and uncover the surprising supernatural elements that surface in family history research. Come along with me on this journey of discovery. Well, hello, this is Natalie, and welcome to episode 111 of Flower in the River. I hope you had a good week. This week, we're diving into how the Eastland disaster rippled through Chicago's Danish community and sent shockwaves across the Atlantic to Denmark itself. True confession, I live in Minnesota. I attended Luther Seminary where, I'm no stranger to Scandinavian people. I'm not myself, but I certainly met quite a few Norwegians and Swedish people in my time. But Danish people, surprisingly, I've not met that many. There was one visiting theologian from Denmark when I was at Luther Seminary, and she was from its capital, Copenhagen. But how much of Denmark's history do I know? True confession, again, not that much. So we don't have time to go into a whole lot of depth here, but let's do an overview here of Denmark, at least in the last half of the 19th century. This is an article on Danes from the Encyclopedia of Chicago, which is created and maintained by the Chicago History Museum. Danes began to immigrate in significant numbers after Denmark suffered defeat by Bismarck's Prussia in 1864. Some fled from the conquered Duchy of Schleswig to escape Prussian rule. Many Danish immigrants had urban backgrounds, with one of 5 coming from the capital city of Copenhagen. In America, they gravitated towards cities. During the 1870s, cheap grain from Russia and American heartland flooded European markets, depressing local agriculture. This led Danes from rural areas to join the immigrants heading toward America. Over 300,000 Danes immigrated in the years 1840 to 1914. Danish immigrants tended to be young, skilled, and well-educated. Many single men came and some families, but young women often stayed home, creating a gender imbalance among the immigrants. The flow of Danish migration was toward the Midwest. The written Danish language was the same as Norwegian, and Swedes could understand it as well. So Danes often lived in mixed Scandinavian communities and intermarried with Norwegians and Swedes. The earliest Danish community in Chicago was around Randolph and LaSalle Streets in the 1860s. Around 1870, some Danes established a South Side enclave around 37th and State Streets that persisted until the 1920s, but the main axis of Danish and Norwegian settlement crossed the Chicago River and moved northwest along Milwaukee Avenue during the 1870s. By 1880, 2/3 of the city's 6,000 Danes lived in the Milwaukee Avenue neighborhoods. A new, heavily Norwegian and Danish neighborhood also began to take shape east of Humboldt Park. By 1910, there were 18,500 first and second generation Danes in the city. Scandinavians had abandoned Milwaukee Avenue to Italian and East European immigrants, and North Avenue was the new Danish-Norwegian commercial center. Humboldt Park remained a major Scandinavian community for a couple of decades, but Danes began to disperse around 1920 to western and northern suburbs. Most commonly, Danish men joined other Scandinavians to work in the building trades as carpenters, masons, painters, furniture makers, and contractors. Many also became small-scale entrepreneurs of grocery, tobacco, and clothing stores. Ethnic hotels, taverns, and cafes also existed. Some Danish families specialized in market gardening and dairying on the fringes of the city. Danish women generally found work in domestic work or shop clerks. Early immigrant luminaries met at the Round Table in Wilkins' Cellar at Randolph and LaSalle, where the Danish consul, Emil Dreyer, generally presided. In 1862, Danish immigrants established Dania as the social club to hold masquerade balls, and the organization grew to sponsor a library, English night school, and mutual aid fund, and missing persons bureau. Trinity Lutheran Church was founded in 1872, followed by several other Lutheran and Baptist churches. A Danish Veterans Society was founded in 1876, the Danish Brotherhood in 1883, and various choral groups from 1886. Many Danish ethnic organizations emerged toward the turn of the century, including societies for gymnastics, cycling, football, hunting, fishing, sharpshooting, and theater. Chicago had a daily Danish and Norwegian newspaper, Scandinavian, for over 50 years, and from 5 to 7 weeklies for several decades. Danish Chicago included an active elite of artists, journalists, clergymen, and professionals. The sculptors, Carl Roll Smith and Johannes Gellert, contributed monuments to the city. Jens Jensen, the leading landscape designer of the Prairie School, designed Chicago's west parks and boulevards, besides promoting forest preserves and state parks. Christian Fenger, an internationally renowned surgeon, taught at Northwestern University and Rush Medical College. Max Hennius, a chemist, founded the American Academy of Brewing and made Chicago an international center of the brewing industry. This was written by J.R. Christensen, and again, it appears in the Encyclopedia of Chicago, and I will give you a link to that. Here's the thing. Unlike many immigrant groups, the Danes assimilated fairly quickly. I'm not quite sure why. They are very unique in so many ways, and I assumed that most Danish immigrants were Lutheran. However, this one surprised me. Many Danes were also Latter-day Saints, aka Mormons. And while most Danish Mormons headed straight toward Utah, a few passed through and settled in Chicago. In summary, the Danes came to Chicago like so many other immigrants did for a variety of reasons, but mostly opportunity. They wanted a better life. They wanted freedom. Who doesn't want that? And they were able to pivot and adapt in a way that I've not seen. But let's talk about how the Eastland disaster affected the Danes in Chicago and in Denmark. Thanks to the Royal Danish Library's media collection website, I was able to find not just one, not just two, but a number of newspapers that were published in Denmark in 1915 that talked about the Eastland disaster. And I will put a link in the show notes for you because it's so interesting to see, again, how this country was responding to what was happening in Chicago, to their people, but also to the population in general. I'm going to read an article from a newspaper called the Fyns Stiftstidende. It was dated August 28th, 1915, and the headline was Eastland. Quote, Farmer Ole Clausen Dalstrup, whose daughter and 2 sons were feared dead in the Eastland catastrophe, has received notification that none of his 3 children were on the steamship on its last journey, and all are in good health. However, 1 son's wife and little daughter were on board, and they have both perished. So this obviously was a paper with a local reach in this area, and they were talking about farmer Ole Clausen, how his family was affected in the Eastland disaster. And of course, this side of the Atlantic in the United States at the time, we didn't even know there was an Ole Clausen. The news of the time didn't always consider how those left back home in the home country were affected. Let me give you a high-level introduction to this family. Now, this is the obituary from the Chicago Tribune, July 31st, 1915. Mrs. Anna Clausen, 32 years old, and her daughter Ella, 8 years old, 4717 Dickens Avenue, were getting on the Western Electric picnic with some friends. Mrs. Clausen was born and educated in Denmark, coming here at the age of 23 years old. She leaves her husband, Klaus Clausen, who also came from Denmark, and a small son. She and her little girl were buried at Mount Olive Tuesday. Anna Clausen was actually born Anna Kirsten Adamsen on the 29th of January, 1884, in Harby, Odense, Denmark, and died, of course, on July 24th, 1915, in Chicago, Illinois. She was the child of Hans Christian Adamsen and Kirsten Andersen, and she immigrated in 1905. Anna Adamsen married Klaus Clausen on the 3rd of April, 1907, in Chicago. Klaus Clausen was born on the 1st of January, 1885, in Dalgard, Denmark, and he was born to Ole Clausen. We've just heard about Farmer Clausen. He also immigrated in 1905 to Chicago, and I'm not sure from what I read if they knew each other prior or they met in Chicago. And their children were Ella Clausen, who was born in 1908 and died on the Eastland, and Edward Clausen, who was born on the 14th of October, 1912, in Chicago, and he died on the 24th of February in 1989 in Riverside, California. About a year after Anna and Ella were killed on the Eastland, Klaus Clausen married again to another Danish woman, and they had a number of children. I will continue reading another paper, The Fun's Social Democrat, published in Copenhagen, and it was from a later issue in 1915. Headline, 2 victims from Funen from Eastland, a solemn funeral. In the Danish colony in Chicago, the great tragedy of the Eastland steamer's capsizing has left deep marks. The other day, Mrs. Anna Clausen and her 7-year-old daughter, Ella, from their home at 4717 Dickens Avenue, were buried with very large attendance. Pastor A.V. Anderson spoke warmly at the home and at the grave as pallbearers served members of the Valkyrie, an organization to which the deceased belonged. Little girls dressed in white stood by Ella's casket, and a wealth of beautiful flowers adorned the house of mourning. Mrs. Clausen was born on Funen 31 years ago. She is survived by her husband, Klaus Clausen, a little son of 3 years, as well as her elderly mother in Denmark, and 2 brothers living in Chicago, Sam and Hans Adamsen. And that's the end of that article, but that article gives us a lot more information about this family and their extended family. Anna had 2 brothers living in Chicago at that time, so perhaps that's the reason she immigrated as well. The Valkyrie connection that was mentioned in that article. So I found only one reference to a ladies' society called Valkyrie that organized a banquet in Chicago in 1915. And the group was, of course, associated with the Danish community in Chicago. And they held events in a place called the Valhalla Hall, a venue that was linked to many Scandinavian immigrants in Chicago. And one more piece about the Valhalla Hall. This is from the Chicago Tribune, March 8th, 1915. Headline, closed for a while. At Valhalla Hall, 3700 Wentworth Avenue, there was a very pretty dance, said Mrs. Merriam. A woman in a costume of peace and a dove for a crown won the first prize. She carried a banner showing that Norway, Sweden, and Denmark are at peace with the world. But the one thing that was objectionable was the winner of the first prize for men. He rolled a screen about with a buffet attached. On the buffet were arrayed whiskey bottles and the sign, closed for a while. None applauded the award of this prize, however, showing the disapproval of the award. The meaning is significant that the next chief of police will not object to the sale of whiskey in ballrooms. The chauffeurs and Unity Club at 3140 Indiana Avenue had a quiet dance. That's the end of that article, and it sounds like somebody was trying to have a joke, and it was not appreciated by the members of this club. But we will continue. The Aftenbladet from Copenhagen, published on the 30th of July, 1915. Headline, The Eastland Catastrophe. Several Danes feared to be among the dead. Unfortunately, there seems to be a strong likelihood that several Danes are among the 800 people who perished in the Eastland catastrophe. Master builder Hayland of Osterbo fears that his son and daughter-in-law are among the drowned. The young Hayland was employed at the Chicago Electric Works, which had rented the Eastland for the ill-fated Sunday outing. In a letter to his father, he had written that he and his wife would join the Eastland trip and meet up with several Danes. That's the end of this small article. The Chicago Electric Works was Western Electric. And this name, Hayland, I tried to find the name or anything close to that name in the list of the dead in the coroner's report, and I couldn't locate it. Perhaps this person survived. I'm not sure, but this one needs a little more work. But isn't it interesting that the news was able to make it fairly quickly to Denmark? And again, it's a much smaller country with a much smaller population in Chicago and even a much smaller population, members of that population working for Western Electric. But they kept in contact. Either families kept in contact with families or they kept in contact with the newspapers of that time in these various locations in Denmark. But as is often the case with the Eastland disaster, selective history coverage, this community has not been covered in depth. But this information at least provides a starting point for someone who wants to do an in-depth analysis. So these articles don't just point to individual grief. They document the Danish network, and they show how families abroad received updates. And they reflect the emotional toll across the ocean just days after the tragedy. So it must have been just hellacious for these families, knowing that there was nothing that they could do but wait and hope. And this, again, is history speaking, but it wasn't speaking in English, so it's also important to seek out coverage in languages other than English, either across the ocean, either ocean, or the diaspora presses of that time. And there are so many articles, but I want to point out an editorial or an essay in another publication called The Berlingske. The headline is 1,200 people drown in Chicago, the Eastland catastrophe, and this one has a byline. M.J. Blichfeld wrote it. Chicago 24th. Down in the narrow Chicago River lies a steamer on its side, wedged between two heavily trafficked bridges, and just below tall warehouse buildings, it has come to rest, like a defiant mockery of modern shipbuilding and professional inspection. For the ship had not only been declared seaworthy on June 7th, it had also been entrusted to carry 2,500 people across the Great Lakes. They were supposed to go on a pleasure trip, but before it even got underway, the ship capsized, simply rolled over, and that happened right by shore, still tethered to the dock by mooring ropes. Had it tilted the other direction, it might never have capsized at all, as the dock would have stopped it. But it leaned away from the dock toward the river, and now 1,000 to 1,200 people have had to pay with their lives. It sounds completely unbelievable. Authorities, inspectors, and marine experts would have declared such a thing impossible even 2 days earlier. And yet, it happened, just like so many other things in our time that were first called unimaginable. Like a thunderbolt on a Saturday morning, the disaster struck Chicago on July 24th. The steamer had taken on too much weight, with too many people crowded on the top deck, all moving to one side. At first they said 200 to 500 had drowned, but as the day wore on, the numbers climbed at a terrifying pace. By evening, the estimated death toll had risen to around 2,000. By then, it was clear how horrific this catastrophe really was. The occasion was a company outing organized by one of Chicago's largest industrial firms, Western Electric Company, which hosts a yearly excursion for its entire workforce and their families, 10,000 to 15,000 people. 5 steamers had been chartered to take everyone across the lake. The Eastland was the first. It had just been filled and was about to depart when the accident happened, and with it, everything came to a halt. The disaster struck so suddenly that passengers had no time to react. The ship began to list, but it had done that before, so no one paid attention, not even the crew. But then, when it tilted to 45 degrees, it quickly rolled fully on its side, plunging most of the 2,500 passengers into the filthy river. Quote, "We didn't think it was a matter of life or death," said one man who survived. "We could see people all around us, and we could hear the streetcars rumbling over the bridge, so of course we thought we'd be pulled up immediately." But before that happened, his wife had gone under, along with many others. On the nearby bridge, there was such a crush of horrified spectators that the bridge began to creak and groan, and the police had to clear it. Will they inspect it now, or will it collapse under one of its many heavy streetcars before it's repaired? The culture of risk and delay. The American is certainly strong in a crisis, brave, selfless, and generous when it matters. He gives freely and helps from the heart, but he does not know how to prevent great disasters. He is too optimistic, even about serious matters like public oversight. "We count the dead," said one editor, "and then we act." Everyone is now discussing what caused this tragedy, and strange facts are surfacing. The ship had capsized before, but without the loss of life. It had been removed from Lake Erie service, refurbished, and reassigned. In 1904, it nearly capsized again. Passengers demanded to be let off. Originally approved to carry 2,200 passengers, the owners asked to raise the number to 2,500, and authorities quickly approved it. Some reports claim the real number was closer to 3,000. Critically, the disaster wasn't even caused by passengers rushing to one side. Instead, the mooring ropes failed, and the ship had no ballast to stabilize it in the shallow Chicago River. Ballast, normally water taken on in deeper water, was impossible to use here, so the ship remained top-heavy. The chief engineer, a Norwegian named Eriksson, tried to release water, but was too late. Even more disturbing, an inspector later testified in court that he would still declare the ship seaworthy if it were raised. No wonder people are asking, how was it allowed to dock in shallow water without ballast? And why did unions call inspections a farce run by the ship owners themselves? The authorities react, or don't. Now the blame game begins. There are too many cooks. Federal officials, Illinois state authorities, local police, the coroner, and none of the experts can agree. Most disturbing, many suspect the Commerce Secretary Redfield, tasked with the inspection, will protect the inspectors under him. Telegrams are pouring into President Wilson demanding Redfield's removal. The press accuses him of trying to orchestrate a whitewash, an official declaration that the disaster was unavoidable. The recovery, the burial, the grief. As the inquiries stall, more and more bodies are recovered. Divers are exhausted, all working day and night in the horrifying conditions below deck. Hundreds more are expected to be found beneath the ship when it is finally raised. Chicago's flour supply ran out. Prices quadrupled. Coffins are scarce. Hearses are booked. Mourners are waiting hours for funerals. Funeral processions clog the streets. In one factory district, 54 doors bore black funeral marks in a single block. The Polish community was hit hardest, about 400 dead. Scandinavians, including 10 to 20 Danes, were also heavily represented. Some families lost 2 or more members. One home lost 2 daughters. A third returned broken and alone. A German boy and girl still waited for their parents to return with promised toys, but they would never come back from the filthy river. At the temporary morgue in a military warehouse, a beautiful dark-haired boy of about 8 lay unclaimed for days. No one knew who he was. Likely, both of his parents were among the dead, and still, no one can account for him. So, in this episode, we explored how the Eastland disaster rippled through Chicago's Danish immigrant community and how the shockwaves even crossed the Atlantic to Denmark. So despite their small numbers, the Danish community was vibrant, tight-knit, and active, with organizations like the Valkyrie Society offering connection and support. When the Eastland capsized, it devastated entire immigrant communities, including the Danes. Newspapers from Denmark captured the heartbreak in real time. Families like the Clausens, who lost Anna and her young daughter Ella, and the Halens, who were feared lost. We hear firsthand how grief stretched across the oceans, as families back in Denmark waited helplessly for news about their loved ones. Danish journalists weren't just chronicling events, they were questioning the systemic failures behind the disaster. How poor inspections, greed, and official indifference allowed tragedy to happen right at the dock. Their reporting captured both the emotional and political aftermath that Chicago's official accounts, in some cases, tried to sanitize. Through the voices of the Danes, both here and abroad, we hear a complete, unvarnished human story of loss, love, and survival. It also reminds us that the story of the Eastland disaster doesn't just belong to Chicago. It was an international story of migration, hope, and heartbreak. The Danish community's experience reminds us that when history speaks, it doesn't always speak in English, and too often it's ignored when it doesn't fit official narratives. But all of these voices matter, and they bring perspective, depth, global connection, and real human faces to what has otherwise been flattened when just presenting statistics. And today, just like 1915, it's up to us, the people willing to dig deeper, to find these stories, lift them up, and let them be heard. And I hope you enjoyed visiting this community and getting to know them a bit, and I will have more stories for you next week. Thanks again. Have a great week. Hey, that's it for this episode, and thanks for coming along for the ride. Please subscribe or follow so you can keep up with all the episodes. And for more information, please go to my website. That's www.flowerintheriver.com. I hope you'll consider buying my book, available as audiobook, ebook, paperback, and hardcover, because I still owe people money. And that's my running joke. But the one thing I'm serious about is that this podcast and my book are dedicated to the memory of all who experienced the Eastland disaster of 1915. Goodbye for now.